Monte la Difensa, Italy, December 1943. A column of men is climbing a sheer rock face in total darkness. Faces blackened with boot polish, ropes and hooks doing the work no trail up this mountain could ever manage. British and American units have already tried to take this position and failed at a cost measured in bodies left on the slope below, a position other formations had already concluded was simply too well defended to actually take by force. These men climb in silence anyway. When they finally reach the German positions at the top, they do not open fire from a distance and give the garrison time to organize a defense. They close the last few yards by hand and finish it with a blade built for exactly this and nothing else. A weapon most soldiers in the entire American military would never even be permitted to see, let alone carry. Why would the United States Army design and manufacture a knife for a single unit and refuse to issue it anywhere else in the entire military? Why did German soldiers reportedly write about the men who carried it with actual fear in their own diaries? And how did fewer than 3,500 of these knives, most of them lost, discarded, or simply worn past recognition in the decades since, become one of the rarest and most sought-after edged weapons any American collector can actually hope to find today? A blade some serious collectors spend entire decades searching for without ever actually locating a genuine example. The unit was the first Special Service Force, a joint American and Canadian commando formation raised in 1942 and trained at Fort William Henry Harrison outside Helena, Montana, a genuinely unusual binational arrangement for an American military unit of this era. Volunteers arrived expecting standard infantry training. Instead, they learned to ski, to climb, to parachute, and to survive extended operations in brutal cold, a curriculum built around one specific assumption, that this force would fight in mountains, in darkness, and at close range far more often than in any open conventional battle most soldiers were actually being trained for elsewhere. Its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Frederick, wanted a weapon no standard-issue trench knife could actually provide, something built specifically around the close quarters, no warning style of fighting his men were being trained for from their very first day at Fort Harrison. Frederick did not start from nothing. The starting point was the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, already proven in British commando units operating across multiple separate theaters of the war, refined further with input from Captain Dermot Pat O'Neill, the force's own close combat instructor and a former Shanghai Municipal Police detective sergeant, the same police force that had originally trained Fairbairn and Sykes themselves years earlier during their own careers policing one of the most dangerous cities in the world at the time. 3 American cutlery companies submitted prototypes built to the force's own specifications, each competing for the exclusive right to actually manufacture whatever design Frederick himself ultimately selected. Frederick personally reviewed them and selected Case Cutlery's own submission, granting that single company sole authority to produce the weapon that would become known simply as the V-42, a decision Frederick made based entirely on his own judgment of what would actually work best for the specific men he commanded. Before we get into exactly what that blade actually looked like in a soldier's hand and the manufacturing problems that nearly undid it before it ever reached combat, if you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Every design decision, from blade profile to pommel weight to the leather washer grip, was tuned specifically to mountain warfare and night raids, and Frederick had no intention of diluting that specificity by issuing the knife more broadly than his own force actually required for its own specific mission set. The finished blade measured 7 5/16 inches, blued steel, 12 inches overall, and light enough at roughly 7 ounces to carry without slowing a man down on a mountain climb, where every extra ounce of equipment genuinely mattered across hours of sustained physical exertion. It was double-edged and narrow, built almost entirely for thrusting rather than slashing, a needle-shaped profile meant to slip past ribs and find something vital with minimal resistance, a genuinely different design philosophy than a general-purpose utility blade would ever actually require. The handle was stacked leather washers, compressed and finished into a grip that held firm even soaked through with rain, sweat or worse, exactly the conditions a mountain campaign fought through an Italian winter actually guaranteed on every single operation. Just above that grip, a small, raised mark was cut into the blade's own base, a tactile guide, letting a soldier orient the blade correctly in pitch darkness, using touch alone, without ever needing to glance down at his own hand, during exactly the kind of silent operation where even a brief downward glance might cost a man his life. And at the very base of the handle sat the detail that gave the weapon its darkest reputation, a pommel finished into a hardened point, deliberately built to be driven into a skull as a killing blow of its own if the blade itself was somehow unavailable or had already been lost during a fight. Early production carried real problems, and none of them were minor footnotes to skip past on the way to the combat record. The first case blades ran slightly longer than the final specification and had a tendency to snap clean off near the tip under hard use, forcing a redesign that shortened the blade to its final length before it ever reached wide distribution to the force's own combat echelon. The original pommel point was sharp enough that it kept catching and tearing at the fabric of uniforms and equipment during training exercises at Fort Harrison, and had to be adjusted before the design was actually finalized for genuine combat issue. Even the scabbard needed correcting, issued at roughly 20 inches, so it could be tied to the thigh and worn beneath the heavy winter parkas the force wore in the mountains. The leather sheath's own tip had no reinforcement at first, and the stiletto's narrow point repeatedly punched straight through it and into the legs of the men actually wearing it during ordinary movement rather than any dramatic combat mishap. A metal insert was added to the bottom of every scabbard after that specific problem became clear. Every one of these fixes reflects a weapon being shaped in real time by the men who actually had to carry it into combat, a level of direct field feedback almost no other standard issue weapon of the entire war ever received from its own intended users. By the time production wound down, official Army records placed total output at approximately 3,420 knives, every one of them built exclusively for the 1st Special Service Force. Only members of the force's own combat echelon, the men actually expected to fight with it, were issued their own example. A small batch of roughly 70 knives reached the United States Navy for a single landing force operation, confirmed through Case's own surviving shipping records, and that exception stands as the only documented instance of the weapon ever leaving the force's own hands during the entire war. The force's own first real combat deployment came earlier that same year, in August of 1943, retaking the island of Kiska in the Aleutians from what turned out to be an already evacuated Japanese garrison, an anticlimactic start for a unit that had trained so intensely for exactly this kind of operation, only to find no actual enemy waiting for them when they finally arrived. Italy was where the force, and the knife riding on every man's own thigh, finally proved what all that mountain and cold weather training had actually been for, a considerably more consequential proving ground than the empty island that had first tested their own operational readiness only months earlier. The force's own combat record earned that exclusivity the hard way, across engagements considerably more brutal than their own initial training exercises back in Montana could have fully prepared them for. After Monte la Difensa, the unit fought through the Italian mountain campaign at a horrifying cost, suffering casualties that reached 77% of its own strength in a matter of weeks, storming one fortified peak after another that larger, better supplied Allied formations had already failed to take, using considerably more conventional tactics and considerably larger numbers of men. Then came Anzio, where a force never numbering more than roughly 1,200 effective men held 1/4 of the entire beachhead perimeter, a stretch of front twice the length assigned to an entire American infantry division, numbering many times their own actual strength, for 99 continuous days without relief, running aggressive night patrols deep into German lines, armed with exactly the knife built for exactly this kind of close, silent work. The number is worth sitting with on its own. 1,200 men, holding a section of front an entire division, would ordinarily defend for 99 straight days through winter conditions and constant enemy contact. Without the rotation and rest, a conventional formation of comparable size would typically have received from higher command. That specific combination, extreme manpower economy stretched across an enormous defensive frontage, forced the force to rely on exactly the kind of aggressive, unpredictable night patrolling its own men had trained for from the very beginning at Fort Harrison. Patrols that depended on stealth and close quarters lethality considerably more than any sustained firefight a conventional infantry unit might otherwise expect to fight against a comparably sized enemy force. It was during those Anzio patrols that the force earned the nickname history remembers it by, a nickname that connects directly back to the same darkness the V-42 itself was actually built to operate in. According to a widely repeated account, a diary recovered from a dead German officer described blackface soldiers who appeared silently out of the darkness and were gone before anyone could raise an alarm, calling them black devils, a description tied directly to the boot polish the force smeared across their own faces before every night operation to avoid any pale skin-catching moonlight or a flare during an actual raid. That specific diary has never been independently verified to exist. No copy has ever surfaced in any archive, and even the force's own historical association describes the story as legend rather than confirmed fact, a distinction worth stating plainly rather than simply repeating the more dramatic version because it makes for a better story. What is better documented is Frederick's own deliberate psychological warfare tactic: printed cards bearing the force's own insignia and a German language message reading, roughly translated, "The worst is yet to come," left deliberately on the bodies of German dead. During those same night raids, specifically to unsettle any German soldier who later discovered one on a fallen comrade. One force sergeant, Victor Kaisner, later gave a first-hand account of a German soldier whispering the words "Black Devil" as his own life ended. A single-source story that nonetheless matches the broader pattern of fear the unit clearly generated among the men facing them across an entire winter of continuous night operations. The force's own binational composition created genuine, practical challenges few other American military units of the era ever had to actually navigate. American and Canadian soldiers serving together under a single, unified command structure, wearing identical uniforms and carrying identical equipment, including the same V-42 Stiletto, regardless of which country's own passport a given soldier actually carried. Pay scales, promotion systems, and military law differed meaningfully between the two national armies, forcing Frederick's own staff to work out administrative compromises that had genuinely little historical precedent to draw on, since no comparably integrated binational American combat unit had operated at this same scale during the preceding decades of American military history. That same integration extended directly to the knife itself, since Canadian and American soldiers within the force received identical V-42 examples from the exact same production runs, meaning the weapon itself carried no national distinction whatsoever within a unit that had, in every practical sense, already dissolved the ordinary boundary between two separate national armies fighting the same war side by side. The 1st Special Service Force was disbanded in December of 1944 near the French Riviera, its personnel folded into other Allied units as the front moved north toward Germany itself, its total membership across the entire war never having exceeded roughly 2,300 men across every single soldier who ever actually served in its ranks. The V-42 went with them into storage, into private collections, and eventually into the kind of quiet obscurity that swallows even the most feared weapons once the war that created them actually ends and the specific tactical need that justified their own existence simply disappears. What it left behind was a design lineage rather than a body count, the emphasis on a purpose-built fighting blade for a specific type of soldier rather than a generic sidearm handed to everyone regardless of their own specific mission, becoming a founding principle of the modern United States Army Special Forces, the direct organizational descendant of Frederick's own original command, and a unit that still traces its own institutional lineage back to exactly the same wartime formation. So closely was the weapon tied to the force's own identity that when the unit designed its own official coat of arms in 1943, the V-42 was worked directly into the artwork, and honor almost no other single piece of equipment from any unit received during the entire war, a formal acknowledgement that the blade had already become genuinely inseparable from how the force itself understood its own identity even before the fighting in Italy had actually finished. Genuine surviving examples verified against Case's own wartime production records now command prices among military collectors that would have astonished the quartermasters who once ordered them built for barely a few dollars apiece under wartime contract. A blade only one unit in the entire United States military was ever trusted to carry, now representing one of the single hardest verified acquisitions in the entire field of American military collecting, sought after specifically because so few genuine examples actually survived the decades between their own original manufacture and today. What do you think mattered more to the legend, the knife itself, or the 99 days at Anzio that gave it a reputation no factory could have manufactured on its own? Leave your answer in the comments below.